Second video for today. As the final speaker of the second session, I want to introduce and explain a proposed continuum model I developed as an outcome of my PhD research into understanding culture as evidence. Joanne has included a copy of the model in the program today. It's called Mediated Record Keeping with the subtitle Culture as Evidence. This model is a proposed model and was designed to challenge and explore new ideas, mapping the outcomes of the research. So ultimately, this idea of talking about the model and what it might bring as a new understanding is my goal for today. I have three things I want to achieve in this short video. Firstly, to explain very briefly how the model came to be, to then describe and explain some of the core features of the model, as well as how to communicate this model and other continuum models going into the future. So the primary focus of the research I undertook over the last 6 years was on gaining a better understanding of the continuum models and how they can be used to build knowledge. I looked closely at concepts coming from the writings about the Records Continuum Model, including ideas about record keeping, evidence, multiplicity and plurality. I also looked at the Information Continuum Model in relation to knowledge generation and designing research. And finally, I used the Cultural Heritage Continuum Model to explore the processes of cultural heritage formation. I particularly wanted to explore online cultural heritage, an area whose complexity I think is largely ignored and quite neglected, even though memory institutions have been capturing and preserving online materials for many years. So as most of you are aware, I chose YouTube as a place to situate my research. I conceptualised YouTube as a record-keeping enabler and as an emergent archival space that some people use for memory making. I spoke to YouTube users as well as domain experts and read lots about various disciplines and other information sources such as the news that help to describe the kinds of roles that YouTube played, what people thought of YouTube and their own role in it, as well as what people thought of its value now and into the future. This was all done over the time that YouTube became a massive hit, a really well-known social media website, and as part of the common vernacular now, we understand what it means to YouTube. So what I wanted to find out is how people understood YouTube in terms of evidence, how recorded information acted as proof, witness, documentation of personal, business, cultural and societal memory. So as part of the research processes, I used, adapted and explored different ways of presenting the continuum models, playing with space and movement. So let's see if we can play this one. One of the first things I attempted was to animate a cultural heritage continuum model, to animate the model that it existed. This was done in Google SketchUp. Quick look. The result was these two short videos. You can Google them and find them on YouTube if you like. The representation of models I want to come back to as a bit of an end mark of the presentation today. So the primary findings from the research was that a cultural heritage continuum model must contain and refer to multiple embedded and meaningful contexts. So these contexts were drawn from the research that I undertook with YouTube, and they include these elements, such as the role of community in establishing identity and evidence, curation of information as a memory-making activity, memory-making as co-creation performed across multiple spaces and influenced by interaction with community, narrative as a key process, mediated memory as a key role in cultural heritage, and mediated record keeping and how this can support cultural heritage. Now there's some terms in there that I'm going to explain as I go along that came out from the research, particularly memory making, evolved through the process of undertaking the research. So, where to start? There are three major changes. So we're back to the model again, and there's three major changes I see on the model that I want to talk to you about today. The first is the introduction of the co-create dimension and the subsequent pluralization of all the labels. So you can see we have mediated memories instead of memory, narratives and identities instead of the singular, and there's plurals on where relevant across the entire model. Okay. The second is the introduction of the curate dimension. So this dimension here, and the outcome this had on the PluralEyes dimension, and the joining together of culture and evidence as a record-keeping and memory model. So, in fact, what happened was that I developed a records continuum model that employed cultural heritage understanding. So perhaps it's not a record-keeping model, maybe it is a cultural heritage model. So these are one of the things that I'd like to talk about today. So the introduction of the co-create dimension was prefaced in the video that I put out this morning, and it was used for Sue and Shannon's session. This includes ideas about conjunction, collaboration, composition, construction, contested, and collision, and the role of the create dimension as transformative. To me, co-create is a necessary term change as it addresses all the complexity of what I think is meant by multiplicity. Co recognises and puts out front that people at all levels of the continuum engage with creation. This is not just about acknowledging the plural in creation, but identifying that creation exists in all dimensions simultaneously, including community, institution, organisation, government, and so on. This change exposes the multiple roles that people play, either wearing one hat or multiple hats, or in a group decision-making situation, such as within a community or an institution or an organisation. Instead of calling all the dimensions co, although this would be quite reasonable, as I suggested this morning, what I did was make all the axes and their labels of intersection as the plural. This is how I've articulated the role of co-creation as it is represented across the model. So all of the plurals here refer to the actual activity of undertaking something as part of creation. So community memories are pluralized because they exist in plural all the time, because creation is part of how they are organised in this circumstance. So in this particular reading of it. So creation is part of it. And the co-create also refers to all of those other dimensions or understandings, including collaboration and cooperation and composition and construction and all of that conjunction as well. So it's actually references multiple understandings of what is going on as a continuum, so within and across dimensions. So secondly, I want to just sort of focus on the curate dimension here. This is a major change to the model, the way that it looks. We now have 5 dimensions. Curate was added primarily as it engages with the way technology is used online to transform and present new information. So curate is not just an act of organisation, or it's not just about pluralising information, but it's an active, creative act of transformation with an audience in mind. So curate is drawn from museum discourse and an understanding of the role of museum in society as an interpreter and to facilitate social interaction. It is, of course, a term that's also been increasingly used in relation to digital collections and the managing of digital objects over time within archives and information science. So curate as a term but potentially points to similarity between record keeping and memory making. It is the juncture between how we understand what record keeping is and its role as memory making. So curation is about the role and potential of record keeping systems as curation tools. It's about exhibition and representation of identity, content, communications, memory, and narrative, as well as participation within information spaces, and plays a vital role in understanding these activities and their outcomes as evidence of their value, including record-keeping systems themselves, which can act as evidence for self and evidence for community and society as memory making and as a system of cultural heritage. So the introduction of the Curate dimension is closely linked to the inclusion of mediated memories and memory making. The former mediated memories is a term borrowed from Jose van Dijk, a Dutch scholar in cultural studies, and the second is borrowed from the continuum discourse initially, but I adapted it and enhanced it in my work. So memory making, first of all, and this is focusing on this dimension here. So I've added memory making and mediated memories into the model. And so before I talk about what the new pluralized dimension means, I just want to briefly do an aside to memory making and mediated memories. So memory making was initially described as a record keeping activity that referred to creation of content, but also the cultural processes and practices engaged in creating something for ongoing value. I identified that people who use YouTube create memories through their activities with the digital technology. So interaction, the action of taking video, as well as editing, uploading, and sharing. I also discovered that memory making is not just about an individual using tools to capture and share information, but it's deeply integrated into what it means to participate in culture and community. Therefore, memory making becomes a fluid and contextual process dependent on and integral to how the actual technology works, but also to the social and cultural interaction between people enabled by technology. So memory making is about the effect or reflection of the activity on the individual and the community and provides a vehicle for narratives to form. It's about how people talk about and remember videos, their own and others. So memory making eventually was clearly defined as a process simply about interaction, interpretation, and communication embedded in practices, norms, and values that contribute to the continuous dynamism, iteration, and progression of cultural heritage. So memory and evidence here, as you can see, I've linked them. And they have a shared perforated line, which means that there's a lot of interaction in between each of those descriptive continua. So evidentiality in this concept. So in the Records Continuum Model, evidentiality and memory are quite linked. But I've separated them, and instead of having memory, I've put memory making as a process and put evidentiality as the processes involved in how evidence is constructed and how it is used over multiple dimensions. So the layering of contexts over space-time. And so they do share actually initial origin in traces. So, and these are about the traces that we talk about in the Records Continuum Model and how they become, through systems, given context over time. Okay, so mediated memories, which shares a line up here with transactionality, is about enabled interactive use of technology to support memory making. So these technologies, such as YouTube, also mediate relationships between individuals and groups of any kind, such as family, community, society, but also in public and private access. A lot of the YouTube users actually talked a lot about how they created a lot of footage and they kept the footage and they would reuse it, and they held it in, some of them held it in high regard, some of them weren't particularly interested in retaining it, and so there was a flow between what they did at home to what they did online and showed online. So the idea of mediated memories is closely linked to identity and evidence, but I've placed it on the model as having a close relationship to transactionality, as I see mediation as a facilitative use of information systems. This is about actions being performed that achieve memory making. So mediated memory systems can help people make decisions about the capture, sharing, access, collaboration, disposal, and continuing value of the recorded information that they have been creating. So Now we get to thinking about what this pluralised dimension really means. If you have a look, a lot of the Curate dimension is referencing primarily what was already in the pluralised dimension in either the Records Continuum Model or the Cultural Heritage Continuum Model. So when I did that, I suddenly had a dimension that I've called pluralised that means something different now. So this space here, Curate, is about the spaces of the collective and the collaborative, about societal narratives and warrant. Curate references the purpose of the activities. It's the why as part of societal activities. The pluralised dimension is about networks and design, about societal mandates, facilitation and systems beyond collective memories. So pluralised to me is about designing for multiplicity, and it engages and connects into the networks, primarily which refers to the internet. So the YouTube case study helped to see that personal record keeping systems exist simultaneously in private and public spaces, as well as across multiple network platforms. Of course, I don't just have a YouTube channel. I've got a Facebook page. I have Twitter. I have an academia.edu page. I have lots of different places where I've been recording information. Not all of them have the same value, of course, and that is part of how we understand what memory making is about, and how it would evolve as cultural heritage over time. We have to make decisions about what is of continuing value. So these personal record keeping systems and the multiple network platforms and how they're all connected provides a new way to perceive plurality as a networked multiplicity. So PluralEyes is about connecting diverse archival spaces with technological creativity. This means looking closely at the small stories, such as the private record keeping systems, and how they connect with institutions or with each other. So it's not necessarily about connecting as an evolution of many people accepting it, or over time and space, like institutional value, but also value between each other. So one of the things that I think about in particular in relation to this is about sharing online and having, people downloading video from each other's computers, often illegally. So, but PluralEyes looks towards data as cultural heritage as well, and as part of the mix of multiplicity. So to go beyond content and see and design for the interconnected network of things. So it's about understanding big data and how we can harvest all of or develop networks to make things more connected. So network memory here, so network memories is a concept that references the internet as a space beyond collective. It's about the distribution of memory across vast electronic spaces and the capture and use of massive data sets, along with the maintenance of pluralized identity across virtual and physical spaces. So networked memory references the deliberate design of networks and the mashing together of multiple data sets to produce something new. So this model, to me, brings together elements of the Cultural Heritage Continuum Model and the Records Continuum Model, as I mentioned. And it plays a role in mediated record keeping. So as a final discussion that I wanted to have about what this model does, and I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about what mediated record keeping is. So the main reason that I decided to call it mediated record keeping was because I think that there's a very close relationship between record keeping and memory making. I think that in a hierarchy, I think that possibly memory making is part of record keeping, and in fact vice versa, record keeping is part of memory making. And so that both play a role in understanding evidence of culture. So what others might call cultural heritage. In this way, I assume all cultural production has an element of memory making, regardless of format. Memory is about the systems of creation, capture, organise, curation, and pluralisation. So mediated record keeping is about the relationships people have with managing recorded information in multiple contexts, facilitated by technologies, frameworks, environments, and identity. It's about the value of record keeping and how these processes contribute to individual, shared, and social memory. A mediated record keeping approach that includes concepts of co-creation and multiple provenances and understandings of multiplicity would provide and enable spaces for multiple voices to be heard across the space-time. So not just shared voices, but multiple voices. And this provides for an opportunity to see a contested point of view in these kinds of spaces. So, finally, I want to have a look a little bit more at the model and why I've been exploring new ways to design continuum models. So one of the biggest challenges that I've thought about is how to incorporate and represent this kind of multiplicity. Is it done with dimensions? Is it done with implied movement? And you can see here that I've got arrows here that give an implication of movement. This, in fact, looks like it's going from outwards like this, but if you have a little bit of a gaze, you could probably see it going inwards as well, from inwards into here. It's a little bit of an optical illusion. So I've been having a little bit of a play of how we might understand the 3 dimensions of it. I've changed the position of these axes so they flow forward. So the implication is that there might be additional dimensions. Of course, I've already mentioned the perforated line or the dotted line. And I put these like this because I wanted to make them so not in the cross-hatch way that's on the other models, because I see them as their continua and their relationship over time. In this is the relationship here, rather than the relationship across a continuum. So, but the thing is that I, as much as I love this design, I see that this one and the other models potentially don't do enough to adequately address that the create exists in all dimensions, and also that there's intersections and that happen in multiple dimensions, so the idea of the multiverse. I was thinking potentially into the future, the kinds of things that I'd like to do is explore more the 3-dimensional animations of this, and I've got a possibility here. This one here is a video of a torus, and it goes through and shows you how in the middle here we would have create, and it flows out and around and goes back into. So I see ultimately that pluralized dimension feeds back into the create dimension. And so I think this is quite an opportunity to look at how we might map that. Of course, on here, this particular version, it's got they're all in very uniform, the dots here, ways of moving, but there's other ones that show where they move in a more chaotic way. This doesn't necessarily address the issue of multiple dimensions, where there might be collisions or intersections. So this is where the dots move it a little bit differently. So this is just an idea that I had about trying to explore this kind of thing. Another one is to have a look at what it means, looking at some of these other kinds of representations of complexity and seeing if they might be able to be used. So ultimately the goal for that is not to make the continuum models more complex or harder to understand, but to help in communicating them and to show visually, which is my preferred medium, how they are a demonstration of multiplicity, and hopefully to get to the simplicity of the models and the understanding of what a continuum approach is. Okay, thank you. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say about the kinds of things that we've presented here today.